Ellie's hand hovered, trembling, over the rough-hewn crate. Inside, nestled like gold, lay rounds of cornbread under burlap. Rain slicked the alley stones, the cold seeping through her thin dress. One lunge, one grab. She could almost taste the grits, feel the ache in her belly ease. Her fingers brushed the damp cloth. Then, a shadow fell across the crate. Not a shout, but a low voice, calm as settling dust. Wait. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The voice stopped Ellie's heart mid-beat. It wasn't the storekeeper's nasal whine, nor the sheriff's gravelly threat. It was deeper, quieter, carrying a weight that froze her more effectively than the icy rain trickling down her neck. She jerked her hand back as if scalded, whirling around, pressing herself flat against the rough, wet planks of Cooper's general store. Her breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the drumming rain on the saloon roof across the alley. A man stood there, taller than her, framed by the narrow alley mouth leading to the muddy main street of Rattlesnake Creek. He wore dark trousers, worn but sturdy boots caked in the reddish mud ubiquitous to Wyoming after rain, and a faded blue work shirt. Over it, he held a thick, gray wool coat, damp at the shoulders. But it was his face that held her gaze. High cheekbones, dark eyes that watched her with an unnerving stillness, set in a face weathered by sun and wind, framed by long, black hair tied back loosely. Comanche, Tala, the whispers called him, the quiet one who fixed harnesses down at the livery, the one folks crossed the street to avoid. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her hunger. He'd seen, he'd tell. They'd lock her up, or worse, run her out of town with nothing but the rags on her back. Where'd she go then? The vast, indifferent prairie stretched in her mind, a hungry maw. Her stomach cramped violently, a cruel reminder of the 3 days since her last meager meal. Stale biscuits begged from the reluctant widow Henderson. Desperation warred with terror. Tala didn't move. He didn't shout for the law. He simply stood, the rain plastering strands of hair to his temples, his expression unreadable. His gaze flicked from her face, pale and smudged with grime, down to the crate of cornbread, then back. He saw the trembling in her hands, the desperate set of her jaw beneath the fear. He saw the dress, too thin for autumn, clinging damply to narrow shoulders, the frayed hem dragging in the alley muck. He saw the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the bruises under her eyes that spoke of more than just a few hungry days. He'd seen that look before, not on a white woman shivering in a Rattlesnake Creek alley, but on faces painted with ochre, gaunt in the cold light after the soldiers came. The hollow eyes, the trembling hands clutching nothing. His mother, trying to shield his sister with her own body. The memory was a physical blow, a familiar ache settling deep in his chest, as constant as the old scar along his ribs. Grief, he learned, didn't fade. It settled into your bones, became part of the landscape you walked. He'd walked into this town because the walking had to go somewhere, and the livery master paid in coin, not promises. He fixed what was broken, leather, wood, sometimes wheels. He spoke little. He endured the stares, the muttered insults, Injun, savage, dirty half-breed. The way space cleared around him like he carried plague. He endured because the alternative was the emptiness beyond the town limits, where the ghosts rode closer. He saw the ghost of that same emptiness in this woman's eyes. Not the ghost of his people, but ghosts nonetheless. Loss had etched itself onto her young face. He didn't need words to recognize kin in desolation. Ellie braced for accusation, for condemnation. Instead, Tala moved. Slowly, deliberately, he shrugged out of the thick wool coat he held. The gesture was so unexpected, so utterly disconnected from the scenarios screaming in her head, that she just stared. He stepped forward, one pace, then another, closing the gap between them. He didn't touch her. He simply held out the coat, offering it like one might offer water to a parched horse. His dark eyes held hers, steady, impossible to read. "Cold," he said, the single word rough but clear, cutting through the rain's patter. Ellie flinched. Was it a trick? A cruel prelude to grabbing her? Her gaze darted to the alley mouth, calculating escape. But his stance wasn't threatening. It was patient. The offered coat hung heavy in his hands, dark wool already beating with rain. The kindness, if that's what it was, felt alien, dangerous. Kindness in Rattlesnake Creek was a currency rarely spent, especially not on strangers, and never between their kind and hers. Or was it hers and his? The lines were blurry when you were clinging to the bottom rung. Another cramp seized her belly, doubling her over for a second. A small, involuntary whimper escaped her lips. Shame flooded her cheeks. She straightened, forcing her chin up, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't feel. "I weren't stealing," she lied, her voice thin and brittle. "Just looking." Tala didn't react to the lie. His expression remained unchanged, a mass carved from weathered wood. He didn't lower the coat. His eyes flickered again to the crate. Then, with his free hand, he reached into a worn leather pouch slung at his hip. Ellie tensed, expecting a knife or rope. Her hand instinctively went to the small, sharp piece of flint she kept tucked in her skirt pocket, her only weapon. He pulled out a small, tightly wrapped packet of oiled paper. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed strips of dark, dried meat. Venison jerky. The smell, rich and gamey, hit Ellie like a physical force. Saliva flooded her mouth, a painful rush. He broke off a generous piece, thick and glistening slightly. He didn't offer it to her directly. Instead, he placed it carefully on top of the burlap covering the cornbread crate. Then, he held the coat out once more. "Eat," he said, another single word, softer this time. "Warm." The simplicity of it, the lack of expectation, the sheer physicality of the food lying there, undid her. The defiance crumbled. Tears, hot and stinging, welled up, mixing with the rain on her face. She hadn't cried when the fever took Pa, coughing his lungs out in the sod hut. She hadn't cried when Ma followed, silent and broken-hearted, just weeks later. She hadn't cried when the bank man, Mr. Driscoll with his too-tight collar and greasy smile, said the land was forfeit, the debts too high. She'd packed her meager belongings, walked the 20 miles to Rattlesnake Creek, and swallowed the tears like bitter medicine. Survival required a hard shell. But this quiet offering in a rain-slicked alley from a man she'd been taught to fear, it cracked the shell wide open. A sob choked her. She looked from the jerky to the coat, then back to Tala's impassive face. There was no pity there, she realized. Not exactly. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps. An understanding of the abyss. Hesitantly, her hand trembling violently now from cold and emotion, she reached out. Not for the jerky first, but for the coat. Her fingers brushed the coarse, damp wool. It felt impossibly heavy, substantial, real. She pulled it towards her, the weight settling on her shoulders like an anchor. It was still warm from his body, carrying the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something earthy like sage. The immediate bite of the wind lessened, replaced by a startling, enveloping warmth. Only then did she reach for the jerky. Her fingers closed around the tough strip. She didn't look at him as she brought it to her mouth. The first bite was salty, chewy, intensely flavorful. It was more than food. It was life flooding back into her limbs, a sudden, fierce focus. She chewed slowly, savoring, the tears still streaming silently. Tala watched her eat. A flicker of something, relief, passed through his eyes, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He shifted his weight, his gaze scanning the alley entrance briefly, a habitual caution. He knew the risk. A white woman, wearing his coat, eating food he'd given her, seen together in the shadows. It was a spark in dry tinder. Old man Cooper, the storekeeper, already watched him like a hawk, convinced every missing nail or dented tin was that engine's doing. Others were worse. The memory of a thrown rock, the hissed word squaw man when he'd once helped a fallen settler woman ride her wagon, surfaced coldly. Kindness here was a luxury paid for in suspicion. He had little to give. The jerky was from a deer he'd tracked and brought down last week, dried carefully. The coat was his only good one, but seeing the raw hunger on her face, the tremor of cold, the ghosts in his own past demanded he act. It wasn't charity, it was a trade perhaps. A piece of meat for a moment where the crushing loneliness receded for them both. He saw her shoulders slowly relax under the wool, saw the frantic edge in her eyes soften as the jerky took the worst edge off the gnawing void inside her. It was enough. Ellie finished the jerky, licking the last traces of salt from her fingers. The warmth of the coat and the food created a fragile bubble of safety in the damp, hostile alley. She finally looked up at him properly. "Thank you," she whispered the words thick. I'm Ellie." He nodded once, a slow dip of his chin. Tala, his name, spoken by him, was a low rumble like distant thunder. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the lessening rain dripping from the saloon's eaves and the distant, tinny sound of a piano starting up inside. The simple exchange of names felt momentous, a tiny bridge thrown across a vast canyon of prejudice and pain. Ellie clutched the edges of the coat tighter. It felt like armor, yet also like a flag declaring an alliance the town would despise. I can't keep this," she said suddenly, guilt warring with a desperate need for its warmth. She started to shrug it off. Tala shook his head, a firm, decisive movement. "You keep." His voice left no room for argument. He glanced towards the alley mouth again, his posture subtly shifting, becoming more alert. Storm coming. Worse than rain. He meant more than the weather. Ellie felt it too, the oppressive weight of the town pressing in. The momentary peace shattered. What now? Where did she go? The widow Henderson's grudging charity had run its course. The abandoned trapper's shack she'd been squatting in, half collapsed and freezing, offered no refuge. She had nothing. The coat felt heavier, a responsibility now. Tala seemed to read the renewed panic in her eyes. He hesitated, then gestured vaguely south, beyond the town limits. Old mission, ruins, wall stand, dry. It was a statement, not an invitation. A piece of information offered, nothing more. A place known only to those who walk the land unseen. Before Ellie could respond, a gruff voice cut through the damp air from the street into the alley. "Hey, you there? What's going on back here?" Old man Cooper. He stood silhouetted in the alley entrance, hunched under a dripping oilcloth slicker, his face a sour mask. His beady eyes narrowed, darting from Ellie, wrapped in a man's coat far too big for her, to Tala standing close by. Suspicion hardened his features like drying mud. "Miss Ellie? That you? And him?" The last word was laden with distaste. "What are you two doing lurking back here?" Ellie froze, her blood turning to ice. Tala didn't move, but Ellie saw the subtle tightening along his jawline, the way his hand drifted slightly closer to the worn leather sheath at his belt that held a simple skinning knife. His stillness wasn't fear. It was the poised alertness of prey sensing the hunter. Cooper took a step into the alley, his boots squelching in the mud. His gaze landed on the burlap covering the cornbread crate, slightly disturbed. "Been both there, my goods?" he accused, his voice rising. "I knew having that one around was trouble. Stealing, is it?" The accusation hung in the wet air. Ellie opened her mouth, a denial forming, but no sound came out. The kindness, the warmth of the coat, the lingering taste of jerky, it all felt like a dream evaporating under Cooper's hostile glare. Tala remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the storekeeper, unblinking. The fragile connection forged in the rain felt brittle, ready to snap under the weight of the town's suspicion. The coat, moments ago a shield, now felt like a target pinned her back. Cooper took another step forward, his hand resting pointedly on the handle of the truncheon he always carried. The piano from the saloon seemed louder suddenly, a jarring counterpoint to the tension crackling in the narrow, muddy space. Ellie clutched the rough wool tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. What happened next wouldn't be kindness. It would be survival. And the quiet Comanche beside her stood as still and watchful as the gathering storm clouds overhead. The accusation hung in the damp alley air, thick and sour as spoiled milk. Old Man Cooper's roomy eyes darted between Ellie, swallowed by Tala's oversized gray coat, and the Comanche man himself, standing unervingly still. His knuckles whitened on the truncheon's worn handle. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of cold wool and fear. Stealing. The word echoed, conjuring images of jail cells, the lash, or being run out onto the vast, pitiless prairie with nothing. Tala didn't flinch. His gaze remained level on Cooper, a dark, unreadable pool. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a subtle grounding. His hand, which had drifted near his belt knife, relaxed, fingers uncurling. He didn't speak. He simply was a silent bulwark against the storekeeper's sputtering outrage. His stillness wasn't submission. It was a different kind of resistance, a refusal to be baited. Ellie found her voice, thin and raspy, but determined. "And no, Mr. Cooper, sir, I weren't stealing." She gestured wildly towards the crate, her hand trembling visibly. I dropped something. My lucky stone. For back home." The lie tumbled out, born of desperation. She remembered the smooth, gray pebble she'd carried from the creek near her parents' farm, lost somewhere during her flight. It rolled under the crate. "I was just fetching it." She forced her eyes wide, trying to mimic the innocent fear she'd seen in children caught scrumping apples. Cooper's suspicious gaze swept the muddy ground near the crate. "Lucky stone? Likely story girl." He squinted at Tala. "And him? What's his business here? Stirring up trouble like always." Tala finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the worn leather pouch at his hip. Cooper tensed, raising the truncheon a fraction. But Tala pulled out only a few copper coins and a silver dime, holding them out in his calloused palm towards the storekeeper. His voice, when it came, was low and even, devoid of inflection. "Nails. 10 penny. For the livery roof." He nodded towards the crate. Saw her drop. Bent down. It was plausible. Simple. Utterly mundane. Cooper blinked, momentarily deflated. His eyes darted from the coins to Ellie, still shivering dramatically under the coat, to Tala's impassive face. The accusation lost some of its heat, replaced by sour disappointment. He wanted it to be theft, wanted the satisfaction of running the quiet Indian out or seeing the destitute girl punished. But coins for nails? A dropped trinket? It was too ordinary, too boringly inconvenient. "Oomph," Cooper grunted, lowering the truncheon slightly. He snatched the coins from Tala's hand, his fingers brushing skin and recoiling as if burned. "Keep your business to the livery, Tala. And you, girl," he jabbed a finger at Ellie, "stay clear of my stock. Ain't no charity store." He gave Tala's coat, enveloping her one last, disgusted look. "And get rid of that filthy thing. Stinks of smoke and other things." He spat into the mud near Tala's boots, a final punctuation, before turning and stomping back towards the street, muttering about shiftless vagrants and bad influences. The tension didn't dissipate with Cooper's departure. It merely changed shape, coiling tighter around Ellie's lungs. The relief was dizzying, laced with a fresh wave of shame. She'd lied. She'd trembled. She'd used Tala's presence, his quiet strength, as a shield. The warmth of the coat suddenly felt suffocating, a reminder of her vulnerability and the debt she couldn't repay. She couldn't meet his eyes. Tala watched Cooper disappear around the corner, his expression unchanged. Only a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed the insult, the familiar sting of filthy. He turned back to Ellie. He saw the shame burning her cheeks, the way she shrunk into the wool. He didn't speak of the lie. Instead, he simply nodded towards the south, beyond the clapboard buildings. Mission, he repeated, his voice barely louder than the dripping eaves. Dry walls. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked silently down the alley in the opposite direction Cooper had gone, his figure blending quickly into the gray twilight and the lingering drizzle. Ellie stood frozen for a long moment, the rain cooling her flushed face. The encounter left her hollowed out, scraped raw. But Tala's words echoed. Mission. Dry. Walls. Shelter. It wasn't an invitation, just information, like pointing out a water source. But it was a lifeline. Clutching the rough wool coat tighter, its scent of wood smoke, leather, and sage strangely comforting now, she gathered the tattered shreds of her courage and slipped out of the alley, keeping to the shadows of the buildings, heading south. The ruins stood a half-mile beyond the last straggling shack of Rattlesnake Creek, nestled in a shallow depression where the wind howled with a lonely voice. It wasn't much. A crumbling stone rectangle, half the roof gone, the remaining timbers blackened by some long-ago fire. Weeds choked what might have been a courtyard, but 3 walls stood relatively intact, forming a corner sheltered from the worst of the wind. It was dry, and it was empty. Ellie stood just inside the broken threshold, the late afternoon light slanting through the gaping roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled of decay, old stone, and damp earth. But compared to the leaky, rat-infested trapper's shack she'd fled, it felt like a palace. A surge of fierce, unexpected gratitude washed over her, directed towards the quiet man who'd pointed her here. Tala, she set to work with the desperate energy of someone claiming territory. Using a broken piece of timber, she swept a corner clear of debris and the worst of the dust. Outside, she gathered armfuls of dry prairie grass, stuffing it into the corner to make a crude pallet. She found a relatively flat stone to serve as a table. It was meager, but it was hers. As she worked, smoothing the grass bedding, a memory surfaced, sharp and sweet as a thorn. Her mother, humming softly, tucking a patch quilt around her in their snug farmhouse loft, the scent of baking bread drifting up from below. The pang of loss was physical, a cold ache deep in her chest. She hadn't felt safe like that in so long. She wrapped Tala's coat around her like the quilt it could never be, the coarse wool scratchy against her cheek. The next morning, stiff with cold despite the coat, Ellie walked back into Rattlesnake Creek. The town felt different after the confrontation, the stares heavier, the whispers more pointed. Women gathered outside the mercantile drew their shawls tighter as she passed, their conversation dying into pointed silence. A group of men leaning against the saloon hitching post watched her with cold assessment, one spitting tobacco juice onto the muddy boardwalk near her feet. She kept her head down, clutching the coat, feeling the weight of Tala's perceived transference upon her. Her destination was Gable's boarding house, a ramshackle 2-story building near the edge of town. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in lines of disapproval, answered her knock. She looked Ellie up and down, her gaze lingering on the obviously masculine coat. "Work?" she echoed Ellie's hesitant request, her voice thin and nasal. "What kind of work you think you're fit for, girl? Look like you blew in with the last dust storm." Her eyes narrowed. "And that coat, that belongs to that Comanche fellow works down at the livery, don't it?" Her lip curled. "He give it to you?" Ellie felt heat rise in her face. "He lent it. I was cold." She straightened her shoulders. "I can work hard, ma'am. Cleaning, laundry, cooking. Mama taught me well." Mrs. Gable sniffed. "Don't need no charity cases, especially not ones mixed up with his kind. Causes trouble. Seen it." She made us shut the door. "Please," Ellie whispered, the word tasting like ashes. "I just need a chance." A corner to sleep. I'll earn my keep. The door paused. Mrs. Gable's shrewd eyes calculated. Cheap labor was cheap labor. Kitchen scraps, she stated flatly. And the outhouse needs scrubbing. Daily. You do that, and you can sleep in the storeroom. No heat, and that coat stays outside. Don't want the smell in my house. She didn't wait for agreement, just jerked her head towards the side of the house. Bucket and lye soaps round back. Get to it. The storeroom was a freezing, windowless closet smelling of damp potatoes and mice. The work was back-breaking, the lye soap burning her chapped hands as she scoured the foul wooden seat and floor of the outhouse. But it was shelter marginally better than the ruins, and scraps meant food, cold porridge, vegetable peelings, stale biscuit ends. She ate them huddled in the storeroom, wrapped in Tala's coat, the smell of lye and filth clinging to her skin. She kept the coat hidden during the day, burying it under sacks in the storeroom corner, a secret comfort and a secret shame. Tala saw her from a distance, saw her trudging back towards Gables after a day of hauling water or scrubbing floors, her shoulders slumped, her face pale and drawn under the grime. He saw the way townsfolk avoided her, the way Cooper watched her with narrowed eyes whenever she passed his store. The coat was gone from her shoulders during the day, but he knew she had it. He'd seen the flicker of fear in her eyes when Mrs. Gable looked her way. He couldn't offer more openly, not without making it worse for her. For both of them, the memory of his sister, little bird, flashed unwanted, her laughter silenced, her small body growing cold in his arms after the coughing sickness took her, one of many in the desperate flight following the soldiers' raid on their winter camp. Helplessness. He knew its bitter taste. Offering direct help to this white woman was like offering water in a leaking basket. It drew attention, invited spillage and loss. So, he helped the way the land helped the hunted, indirectly, silently. One morning, as Ellie approached the foul outhouse bucket, she found a small, sharpened piece of flint lying beside it, its edge honed finer than her own lost one, perfect for scraping stubborn filth. Another day, tucked under the edge of the worn burlap sack she used as a blanket in the storeroom, was a small, tightly woven grass pouch. Inside were dried chokecherries, tart and chewy, a burst of unexpected sweetness in her mouth of scraps. No note, no sign, just there, like the mission ruins. He also watched the town's mood. He heard the mutterings near the livery where he worked, mending harnesses and resetting wagon wheels. That girl, tucking up with the engine, seeing her wear his coat, bold as brass, a skin for trouble, heard Driscoll's back in town. Bank business. Reckon he'll be looking for that girl. What with her folks' debt still hanging. Driscoll. The name landed on Tala like a cold stone. He'd seen the man before, slick-haired, wearing a town suit that looked out of place, riding a fine horse. He'd watched Driscoll talking to Cooper, both men laughing in a way that held no warmth. If the debt collector was back, Ellie's tenuous safety at Gables, or even in the ruins, wouldn't last. The town's prejudice was a slow poison. Driscoll's legal claim could be a swift knife. One evening, finishing a repair on a rancher's heavy wagon trace, Tala received his pay, a few coins and a small twist of salt pork, from Jed, the livery master. Jed, a man of few words who valued work over talk, handed it over without meeting Tala's eyes. Good work, he mumbled. Then, as Tala turned to leave, Jed added, low and quick, heard Driscoll's skin around. About that Henderson girl. Ellie. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice. Just so's you know, it wasn't kindness. It was a warning, a man protecting his reliable worker from potential trouble. Tala nodded once, the only acknowledgement, and pocketed the coins and meat. He didn't go back to the lean-to he occupied at the far end of the livery. Instead, as dusk painted the sky bruised purple and orange, he walked south towards the mission ruins. He moved silently, a shadow among the sagebrush and rocks. He needed to see, to warn. He wasn't sure. He stopped on a low rise overlooking the depression. The crumbling walls were just visible in the fading light. Ellie was there. She'd returned to the ruins after finishing her tasks at Gables, seeking the fragile sense of space it offered, away from the boarding house matron's suspicious gaze. She had Tala's coat wrapped around her, sitting on her grass pallet, carefully stitching a long tear in her thin dress with a bone needle and thread she'd salvaged. She hummed softly, a tuneless fragment her mother used to sing, the simple act of mending a small defiance against the unraveling of her life. Tala watched from the shadows. She looked small, swallowed by the vast ruin and the oversized coat, yet there was a determined set to her shoulders as she worked the needle. A flicker of something akin to respect warmed the cold knot of worry in his chest. She was surviving, like the tough prairie grass, pushing through cracks in the mission stones. He turned to leave, unseen. He would leave the twist of salt pork near the broken threshold at first light. A small thing, but as he moved, his boot dislodged a loose stone. It clattered down the slope, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. Ellie's head snapped up, the humming cut short. Her eyes, wide and startled, scanned the darkening hillside. She saw nothing but shifting shadows and sagebrush. But the feeling of being watched, intensely and specifically, prickled across her skin. Was an animal? A townsfolk spying? Or him? The silence stretched, heavy and suddenly charged. She slowly lowered her sewing, her hand unconsciously tightening on the rough wool of the coat sleeve. The fragile piece of the ruins felt breached. Someone knew she was here. The question, hanging unspoken in the cooling air, was far more ominous than any accusation from Cooper. Who? And what did they want? The memory of Jed's muttered warning about Driscoll asking questions coiled like a snake in the pit of her stomach. She stared into the gathering darkness beyond the broken walls, every nerve taut, waiting for the shadows to move again. The clattering stone echoed in Ellie's ears long after the sound faded. Silence rushed back into the mission ruins, thick and watchful. Every shadow in the crumbling archways seemed to deepen. Every rustle of dry grass outside became the scrape of a boot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the coarse wool of Tala's coat. She froze, the bone needle clutched tight in her whitened knuckles, her half-mended dress forgotten in her lap. Who? The question screamed in her mind, louder than Cooper's accusations. An animal? Unlikely. The stone had fallen deliberately, dislodged. A townsfolk? Spying for Cooper or Mrs. Gable, or out of idle malice. Or Driscoll? Jed's warning slithered back in her thoughts. Heard Driscoll's a skin around. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin grass pallet, chilling her despite the coat. Slowly, silently, she set aside her sewing. She slid backwards, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the sheltered alcove formed by the 3 standing walls. Her fingers found a sharpened piece of flint Tala had left, her only weapon. She pulled the coat tighter, its familiar scent of wood smoke and sage now mingled with the sharp tang of her own fear. She became part of the ruin's shadow, breath held, eyes straining into the deepening twilight beyond the broken walls. Minutes stretched, each one an eternity. Nothing moved but the wind sighing through the gaps in the stones. The prickling sense of being watched gradually lessened, replaced by a trembling exhaustion. Had they gone? Or were they simply waiting? Tala melted back into the sagebrush, a phantom dissolving into the landscape. He'd seen her reaction, the snapped-up head, the wide-eyed terror, the way she'd shrunk into the shadows like a cornered rabbit. His own carelessness with the stone felt like a betrayal of the fragile piece he'd tried to offer her. He hadn't meant to frighten her, only to see if she was safe, if the warning about Driscoll needed delivering immediately. Now, his presence had become another source of her fear. He moved silently, circling wide around the ruins, putting distance between himself and the place where he'd caused her panic. The cold night air bit at his face, sharpening his senses, but also stirring unwanted memories. The crunch of frost underfoot, the smell of cold earth, it transported him back to a different hillside, years ago, watching, helpless, as the blue-coated soldiers moved through the winter camp below, the sharp cracks of their rifles echoing like breaking ice. The frantic scramble, the smoke, the silence that followed. Little Bird's hand growing cold in his. The helplessness he felt now, watching Ellie flinch from shadows, was an old, familiar ache, a ghost walking beside him. He couldn't approach her. Not now. Not with the town's eyes sharpening. Not with Driscoll sniffing around. His help had to remain unseen, a current flowing beneath the surface. He thought of the twist of salt poor Jed had given him his pay. He'd intended to leave it for her at the ruins' threshold at dawn. But after startling her, the gesture felt insufficient, almost insulting. She needed warmth, sustenance, not just scraps. An idea formed as he walked the long way back towards Rattlesnake Creek, keeping to the draws and gullies. In the lean-to tacked onto the far end of Jed's livery, where he slept surrounded by the smell of leather and horse, he kept few possessions. Among them was a small, dented tin pot, blackened by countless fires. It had belonged to his father, used for brewing bitter willow bark tea or simmering thin stews on the trail. It was a humble thing, but solid. Useful. More useful than salt pork alone. He retrieved it, along with a small pouch containing a handful of coffee grounds he'd traded mending for. He wrapped the salt pork and the coffee grounds carefully in a scrap of oiled cloth, placing the bundle inside the pot. Before first light, while the town still slept under a blanket of frost, he would leave it where she would find it. A pot meant she could boil water, make coffee, warm herself. A small defiance against the encroaching cold and fear. Ellie didn't sleep. She spent the night huddled in her corner, the flint shard a cold comfort in her hand, jumping at every night sound. When the gray light of dawn finally seeped into the ruins, painting the stones in pale, cold hues, exhaustion warred with residual fear. She crept cautiously to the broken threshold, flint still ready, peering out. The frosted grass sparkled, undisturbed except by small creatures. No footprints larger than a rabbit's marred the delicate crust near the entrance. Had she imagined it? The dread about Driscoll felt no less real. Then she saw it, not on the ground, but placed carefully on a low, flat stone just inside the broken wall, sheltered from the wind. A small, battered tin pot. Her breath caught. She approached slowly, scanning the surrounding hillside. Empty. She picked up the pot. It was cold to the touch, heavy for its size. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found the salt pork and, nestled beside it, a precious handful of dark coffee grounds. Her eyes stung. Tala. It had been him last night. Checking, caring, in his silent way. The fear of the watcher eased, replaced by a wave of profound, shaky relief and gratitude that tightened her throat. He hadn't abandoned her to the shadows. He'd seen her fear and answered with this. Warmth, sustenance, a tool for survival. She clutched the pot to her chest, the cold metal warming against the coat. She needed a fire. Gathering dry twigs and grass from the sheltered lee of the walls, she built a small, discreet pile in the corner farthest from the opening, using the flint to coax a fragile flame to life. The smell of wood smoke, mingling with the scent of brewing coffee as she poured precious water from her skin into the pot, was the first truly comforting thing she'd known since leaving the farm. As the water heated, she examined the coat she wore. The sleeve she'd been mending last night was still torn. Taking the bone needle and thread, she resumed her work, her stitches small and neat, a tangible way to repay his kindness, however small. The rhythmic motion, the smell of coffee, the growing warmth from the tiny fire. For a stolen moment, the ruins felt less like a refuge of last resort and more like a place. Her place. The fragile peace of the morning couldn't shield her from Rattlesnake Creek. At Gable's, the hostility had crystallized. Mrs. Gable met her at the back door, arms crossed. Her eyes, like chips of flint, raked over Ellie, lingering on the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke in her hair, the careful mend on her dress sleeve. Out all night again. Mrs. Gable's voice was a whip crack. Squat in that engine's ruin, I reckon. Bringing his filth back here. She thrust a bucket of icy water and the lye soap towards her. The privy's foul again, and the kitchen floor needs scrubbing. Properly. None of your half measures. She leaned closer, her breath sour. And I seen you looking at that livery hand. Keep away, girl. That kind of trouble ain't welcome near decent folk. Driscoll's in town proper now. A skin questions. You bring his trouble down on my house, you're out. Coat or no coat. The threat hung in the frosty air. Ellie kept her eyes down, accepting the bucket. The lye bit into her cracked, red hands as she scrubbed the foul wooden seat, the cold water numbing her fingers. The townsfolk were worse. Crossing the muddy street towards Cooper's store later that day, sent to buy a pennyworth of soda ash from Mrs. Gable's laundry, she passed two women. Their whispers, meant to carry, sliced through the crisp air. Seen her, bold as brass, wearing that savage's blanket, living out there like animals. Driscoll settle it. Debt and decency. Ellie hunched her shoulders, feeling the invisible brand Tala's generosity had seared onto her. At Cooper's, the storekeeper himself served her, his expression sour. He slapped the small packet of soda ash on the counter. 50 cents. Pennyworth, Mr. Cooper, Ellie whispered, holding out the single copper Mrs. Gable had given her. Price went up, Cooper said flatly, his eyes hard. Cost of freight, or maybe cost of associating with undesirables. He nodded meaningfully towards the street. Ellie followed his gaze. Leaning against a post outside the saloon, talking with a man in a deputy's star, was a figure that turned her blood to ice. Driscoll. He wore a Darktown suit and a bowler hat, incongruously neat against the rough frontier backdrop. He wasn't looking her way, but his presence was a palpable threat. He held a folded paper in his hand, gesturing with it as he spoke to the deputy. A document. Her debt. Her life. Reduced to ink on paper. Panic flared. She dropped the penny on the counter, grabbed the soda ash, and fled, not caring about the change or Cooper's sneer. She felt Driscoll's attention shift, felt his eyes land on her retreating back like a physical weight. Tala saw her flight from the doorway of the livery, where he was oiling a stiff harness. He saw the pale fear on her face, the way she practically ran past the saloon, clutching the small packet. He saw Driscoll watch her go, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips as he tucked the folded paper into his coat pocket and said something that made the deputy laugh. A cold fury, ancient and deep, stirred in Tala's chest. It was the same look the land agents had worn before the soldiers came. The look of men who saw people as obstacles or commodities. He worked with fierce concentration, the leather groaning under his strong hands. He couldn't fight Driscoll's paper, not in the town's eyes, but he could make the ruins safer, wetter, more of a refuge. That afternoon, scavenging near the creek, he found several large, curved sections of bark from a fallen cottonwood. Sturdy, watertight, if angled right. He hauled them back towards the mission ruins, taking a circuitous route, careful not to be seen heading directly there. He left them stacked neatly just inside the broken wall, near the spot where he'd left the pot. Overhead cover, shelter from rain and snow. He also left a smaller packet this time, dried wild plums, tart and chewy, wrapped in a broadleaf. He lingered only long enough to see that she'd taken the pot and the earlier gifts. The fire pit was cold, but neatly swept. He noticed the careful mend on the coat sleeve, her small, even stitches. A flicker of warmth, unexpected and profound, cut through the cold dread. She was strong. She was mending things, like he mended leather and wood. He turned to leave, a silent wish for her safety forming in his mind. Ellie returned to the ruins that evening, her body aching from scrubbing, her spirit bruised by the day's encounters. The sight of the stacked bark sections stopped her in her tracks. Overhead cover, real shelter. Tears pricked her eyes again, this time of overwhelmed gratitude. And the plums, a burst of sweetness against the bitterness of Gable's scraps and the town's venom. She built her fire in the tin pot this time, brewing weak coffee, the warmth a small bulwark against the world. She ate a plum, savoring the tart juice. As darkness fell, she felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't be driven out, not by Mrs. Gable's threats, not by the whispers, not even by Driscoll's papers. She had shelter. She had a little food. She had a connection. Faint, silent, but real. She took the largest piece of bark and, using stones for support, propped it carefully against the inner wall, creating a slanted roof over her sleeping corner. It was crude, but it blocked the wind and would shed rain. She smoothed her grass pallet, wrapped herself in Tala's coat, and sat by the small fire, sipping the hot, bitter coffee. For the first time, she felt not just survival, but a fragile sense of homemaking. She remembered her father patiently chinking the logs of their sod house, her mother humming as she hung herbs to dry. She was building her own refuge, stone by stone, bark slab by bark slab, stitch by stitch. The sound of a horse's whinny, startlingly close, shattered the quiet. Not the soft nicker of a grazing animal, but a sharp, nervous sound. Ellie froze, the tin cup halfway to her lips. Hoofbeats, not on the distant trail, but close, approaching the ruins. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, kicking dirt over her tiny fire, plunging her corner into near darkness. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall under her new bark shelter, the flint shard clutched tight. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the broken wall. A saddle creaked. Boots hit the ground, crunching on the frosted earth. Heavy, deliberate steps, coming closer, stopping at the threshold. A dark shape filled the opening, silhouetted against the starlit sky. Not Tala's lean silhouette, broader, hatted. The smell of cigar smoke drifted in on the cold air. "Evening, Miss Henderson," a smooth, unfamiliar voice called out, too loud in the stillness. "Driscoll, mind if I come in? We have business to discuss." Driscoll's voice sliced through the frosty air, smooth as a sharpened blade, his silhouette filling the mission ruins' broken threshold. The cigar's acrid tang clung to Ellie, heavier than the damp wool of Tala's coat. Her fingers tightened on the flint shard, its edge biting into her palm. The tin cup of cooling coffee trembled in her other hand, forgotten. She pressed deeper into the shadowed corner under the bark slab, heart pounding like hooves on frozen earth. The ruins, her fragile refuge, felt like a trap now, the stone walls closing in. Driscoll stepped forward, boots crunching frost. His bowler hat tilted slightly, catching starlight, and his dark suit seemed untouched by the frontier's grit. "Miss Henderson," he repeated, his tone dripping with false courtesy, "you're a hard woman to find." He gestured with a folded paper, yellowed and creased, held loosely in his gloved hand. "This here's a matter of debt. Your pa's land. $300, plus interest. Bank, don't forget." His eyes, cold as river ice, pinned her where she stood. Ellie's throat tightened. $300. A fortune she'd never see, not scrubbing privies or hauling water for Mrs. Gable. The farm was gone, burned to ash in her memory alongside her parents' fever-worn faces. "I ain't got that kind o' money," she managed, her voice thin but steady. "Ain't got nothing." Driscoll's smile was a predator's, slow and sharp. "Oh, folks always got something. A name, a connection." His gaze flicked to the tin pot by the smoldering fire, the mended coat swallowing her frame. "Seems you've been cozying up with that livery engine. Tala, they call him. Curious company for a respectable girl." The word respectable twisted, a barb meant to sting. Ellie's defiance flared, hot against the cold fear. "He's kinder than you'll ever know," she snapped, chin lifting. "And I ain't respectable. I'm just trying to live." Her grip on the flint tightened, a futile weapon against a man like Driscoll, whose power lay in paper and influence, not fists. Driscoll chuckled, low and humorless. He took another step, his boot nudging the edge of her bark shelter. "Live? Squat 10 in ruins like a rat? That's a chain, girl. You run, it follows. You hide, I find you. And if you're tied to that Comanche," he let the thread hang, heavy as the cigar smoke curling around him. "Folks in Rattlesnake Creek don't take kindly to his sword, or them that keep his company." Before Ellie could retort, a sharp crack echoed from the hillside beyond the ruins, a branch snapping underfoot, deliberate and loud. Driscoll's head whipped toward the sound, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. Ellie froze, her breath catching. Tala! It had to be him, watching again like last night. She prayed he stayed hidden, that he didn't step into this trap. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Driscoll's eyes scanned the darkness, but the hillside gave nothing away. Finally, he relaxed his grip on the gun, his smile returning, colder now. "Seems we'll finish this another time, Miss Henderson. You think on that death. I'll be back. With company." He tipped his hat mockingly, turned, and strode back to his horse, the saddle creaking as he mounted. The hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving only the wind's low moan and the faint crackle of Ellie's dying fire. She sank to her knees, the flint slipping from her hand, the tin cup tipping, spilling cold coffee into the dirt. Her body shook, not from the frost, but from the weight of Driscoll's words. A chain. She saw it now. Her father's signature on a banknote, her mother's weary face as the fever took hold, the sod house sold to strangers. And Tala, tangled in her mess now, his kindness making him a target. Guilt and gratitude warred in her chest, as sharp as the flint's edge. Tala watched from the shadow of a gnarled cottonwood, his breath slow and silent. He'd come to leave the bark slabs, had seen Driscoll's horse tethered outside the ruins, and had stayed, a ghost among the sagebrush. The branch snap was no accident. He'd broken it to draw Driscoll's attention, to give Ellie a moment to breathe. He saw her now, crumpled by the fire, the coat a bulky shield around her trembling frame. He wanted to go to her, to say something, anything to ease the fear etched in her face. But he knew his presence would only tighten the noose the town was tying around them both. His thoughts drifted to the past, unbidden. A leather pouch, much like the one he carried now, hanging from his mother's belt, filled with dried berries for his sister. The soldiers had torn it open, scattering the contents into the snow. He'd gathered what he could after they fled, his hands numb, his sister's small body already still. That helplessness clawed at him now. He couldn't fight Driscoll's paper, not with a knife or words. But he could help Ellie endure, survive. He moved silently back to the livery, the night swallowing his steps. In his lean-to, he rummaged through his sparse belongings. A patched wool blanket, threadbare but warm, used on long hunts. He folded it carefully, adding it to a small bundle with a bone-handled awl, sharp enough for leather or wood. Tools for building, for mending. He would leave them at the ruins before dawn, near the bark slabs. She was making a home there. He'd seen it, the swept fire pit, the mended coat. He wouldn't let Driscoll's shadow snuff it out. Morning broke cold and gray, the frost thicker now, crunching under Ellie's boots as she emerged from her bark shelter. Her eyes were gritty from sleeplessness, Driscoll's voice still echoing in her mind. But the sight of the new gifts, a folded blanket, and all tucked inside, stopped her cold. Tala again. Her fingers brushed the blanket's rough weave, and tears pricked her eyes. She remembered her mother's hands, calloused from years of sewing, tucking a similar blanket around her on cold farm nights. The memory was a knife, sweet and sharp. She clutched the awl, its bone handle smooth, a tool for creation, not destruction. Tala wasn't just giving her things. He was giving her a way to fight back, to build something from nothing. She spent the morning reinforcing her shelter, using the awl to bore holes in the bark slabs, lashing them together with strips of grass to form a sturdier roof. The work warmed her, gave her purpose. She boiled the last of the coffee grounds in the tin pot, the bitter warmth steadying her nerves. She left a small gift in return, a braided grass cord, knotted carefully, placed on the stone where Tala's gifts appeared. A silent thank you, a thread of connection. At Gable's boarding house, the day was a gauntlet. Mrs. Gable's demands were relentless, scrubbing floors, hauling firewood, washing linens in icy water that left Ellie's hands raw. The townsfolk's hostility had hardened into something sharper. As she carried a basket of damp laundry to the line, a group of men outside the saloon watched her, their whispers carrying, "Driscoll's got her number now. Hanging with that engine's gonna cost her." A boy, no older than 10, threw a clod of mud, striking her skirt. She didn't flinch, but her shoulders tightened, the braided cord hidden in her pocket a small anchor. Tala felt the town's mood shift like a storm gathering. At the livery, Jed's usual curt nods were replaced by sidelong glances. A rancher, dropping off a lame horse, muttered about trouble brewing and that Henderson girl dragging Tala into her mess. The air carried the weight of Driscoll's influence. His name whispered in the saloon, his suit a stark contrast to the town's dust. Tala worked silently, mending a cracked axle, his hand steady but his mind racing. Driscoll wasn't just after Ellie's debt. He was after control, a man who thrived on bending others to his will. Tala had seen his kind before. Land agents who smiled as they burned villages, their papers as deadly as rifles. That afternoon, as Ellie returned to Gables with a sack of flour from Cooper's, she saw Driscoll again. He stood outside the bank, speaking with the deputy from yesterday, his gloved hand waving that same folded paper. Their eyes met across the street. His smile was a blade, promising no mercy. She hurried past, head down, the flour sack heavy in her arms. But as she turned the corner, a tattered notice nailed to a post caught her eye. A public auction, scheduled in 3 days for unclaimed debts and properties. Her name wasn't listed, but her father's was, the farm's description unmistakable. Her stomach dropped. Driscoll wasn't just hunting her. He was dismantling her past, piece by piece. Tala saw the notice too, later, as he led a mended wagon to the livery's gate. His jaw tightened, the old fury rising. He couldn't read the fine print, but he recognized the bank seal, the weight of legal theft. He thought of his people's lands, parceled out by men like Driscoll, their sacred places reduced to lines on paper. He wouldn't let Ellie face that alone. That night, he returned to the ruins, moving silently. He didn't approach her fire, didn't risk startling her again. Instead, he left a final gift, a small, carved wooden spoon, simple but smooth, left on the stone. A tool for eating, for living. As he turned to leave, he saw her silhouette through a gap in the ruins, sitting by her fire, the braided cord now tied around her wrist. His chest ached with something he couldn't name. Hope, perhaps, or recognition. Ellie, warming her hands by the fire, felt the weight of the day. The auction notice, Driscoll's smile, the town's venom, it all pressed down, threatening to crush her fragile refuge. But the braided cord, the awl, the blanket, they were anchors, proof of Tala's quiet presence. She didn't know how to repay him, not yet, but she would. She had to. As she banked the fire for the night, a new sound broke the silence. Not a stone, not a branch, but a low, deliberate whistle, sharp and clear from the hillside. Not an animal, not Tala's careful silence. It was a signal meant to be heard. Her heart seized. She grabbed the flint, crept to the edge of her shelter, and peered into the darkness. A flicker of movement, a lantern's glow, bobbing low, approaching from the trail. Not one light, but two. Voices, muffled but purposeful, carried on the wind. Driscoll's men? The deputy? Someone worse? The ruins, her sanctuary, were no longer hidden. Someone was coming, and they weren't alone. The lantern's glow flickered like twin predators' eyes, slicing through the darkness beyond the mission ruins. Ellie crouched beneath her bark shelter, the flint shard biting into her palm, her breath a shallow rasp swallowed by the wind's low howl. The whistle's sharp note lingered in her ears, deliberate, a signal meant to flush her out. The voices, low, masculine, edged with purpose, grew closer, boots crunching frost-crusted earth. Not Tala's silent tread, not his careful gifts. These were hunters, and the ruins were no longer sanctuary. Her eyes darted to the braided grass cord around her wrist, the carved wooden spoon on the stone, the tin pot still warm from her fire. Tala's anchors. She wouldn't let them be taken. She smothered the fire's embers with a handful of dirt, plunging her corner into near blackness. The cold stone wall pressed against her back, the coarse wool of Tala's coat her only shield. Her mind raced. Driscoll? His deputy? Or townsfolk, stirred by whispers of her and Tala's alliance? The auction notice, her father's farm, her past, loomed in her memory, a noose tightening. She couldn't fight them, not with a flint shard, but she could run. The prairie beyond the ruins was vast, unforgiving, but it was a chance. Tala watched from a low ridge, his body a shadow among the sagebrush. He'd heard the whistle, seen the lanterns bobbing up the trail. Two men, Driscoll's deputy, recognizable by his slouched hat, and another, a wiry ranch hand who'd sneered at Tala in the saloon. Driscoll wasn't with them, but his hand was clear in their purpose. Tala's fingers tightened around the worn handle of his skinning knife, a cold fury rising. He'd seen this before. Men with torches, not lanterns, coming for his people's camp, their faces alight with righteous hate. He'd been too young to stop it then, too weak to save Little Bird. Not now. He moved, silent as moonlight, circling wide to flank the approaching men. His boots avoided loose stones, his breath controlled. He saw Ellie's fire die, her silhouette vanish into the ruined shadows. Good, she was hiding. But hiding wouldn't be enough. The deputy's voice carried, sharp and mocking. Come on out, girl. Ain't no use skulking. Driscoll wants his due. The ranch hand laughed, a cruel bark, his lantern swinging as he kicked at the broken threshold. Ellie's heart seized. She recognized the deputy's voice, Hank, the man who'd laughed with Driscoll outside the bank. The auction was tomorrow. This wasn't about talk anymore. It was about dragging her back, debt or no debt. She clutched the flint, calculating. The ruin's back wall had a narrow gap, half collapsed, leading to a gully. If she could slip through, reach the creek. But the lanterns were too close, their light sweeping the stones. She'd be seen. Tala acted. He scooped a fist-sized rock from the ground, its weight solid in his calloused hand. He tossed it high, arcing it over the ruins to land with a sharp clatter in the brush beyond. The deputy and ranch hand froze, lanterns swinging toward the sound. What's that? The ranch hand hissed, drawing a pistol. The deputy, bolder, strode toward the brush, his lantern casting jagged shadows. Probably a damn coyote, or her Injun friend. The word Injun dripped with venom. Ellie seized the moment. She scrambled through the gap, her skirt catching on jagged stone, tearing with a soft rip. She didn't stop, crawling low into the gully, the frost biting her hands. The braided cord snagged on a root. She yanked it free, her breath hitching. The gully sloped toward the creek, its frozen trickle glinting under starlight. She moved, half sliding, the coat's bulk slowing her but shielding her from the cold. Tala saw her escape, a flicker of movement in the gully. Relief warred with urgency. The men were distracted, but they'd search the ruins next. He needed to draw them away. He tossed another rock, this time closer, into a clump of sagebrush. It rustled loudly, drawing a curse from the deputy. There! Move! The men split, the deputy charging toward the sound, the ranch hand circling the ruin's perimeter, his lantern bobbing like a will-o-wisp. Ellie reached the creek, her breath ragged, the flint still clutched tight. The water was shallow, ice-crusted, but it could hide her trail. She waded in, the cold a shock that stole her breath, numbing her ankles through her worn boots. She moved downstream, keeping low, the coat dragging in the current. The lantern's glow faded behind her, the men's voices growing fainter. But safety was a lie. Driscoll's reach was long, and Rattlesnake Creek's hatred longer. Tala shadowed the men, keeping to the high ground. He saw the deputy stumble in the brush, cursing, his lantern dimming as it tipped into the dirt. The ranch hand shouted, "She's gone. Check the gully." Tala's chest tightened. They'd find her tracks soon. He needed to act, not just distract. He slipped down the ridge, silent, and approached the ruin's edge. The ranch hand was close, his back to the broken wall, lantern raised. Tala moved like a breath, knife sheathed but hand ready. He didn't want blood, not yet, but he'd protect her. Ellie paused, crouching behind a fallen log, the creek's chill seeping into her bones. The lanterns were distant now, but the men's shouts carried. She saw a third shadow move, swift and silent, near the ruins. Tala, her heart leapt, fear and gratitude tangling. He was risking everything. She wanted to call out, to warn him, but her voice would betray them both. Instead, she pressed the braided cord against her wrist, a silent prayer for his safety. The ranch hand turned, his lantern catching Tala's silhouette for a heartbeat. "You," he snarled, raising his pistol. Tala didn't flinch. He stepped forward, hands empty, voice low and steady. "She's not here. Leave." The words were a command, not a plea, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse than pistols. The ranch hand hesitated, the lantern trembling in his grip. The deputy, hearing the shout, crashed back through the brush, his own gun drawn. "Tala, you damn fool," he spat. "Harboring a debtor? You'll swing with her." Tala's eyes, dark and unyielding, held theirs. "No debt here, just a woman trying to live." Ellie, hidden, heard the exchange. Her chest ached. Tala was standing for her, as he had in the alley with Cooper. She couldn't let him face this alone. She rose, flint in hand, and stepped from behind the log, her voice cutting through the night. "Leave him be." The men spun, lanterns swinging, pinning her in their glare. Her dress clung wetly, the coat heavy with creek water, but her chin was high, defiance burning through her fear. The deputy sneered, stepping closer. "Got you both now? Driscoll be pleased." But before he could move, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the brush. A coyote, startled by the commotion, its eyes glinting in the lantern light. The ranch hand yelped, stumbling back, his pistol firing wild, the shot echoing across the hills. The deputy cursed, distracted, and Tala seized the moment. He lunged, not for the men, but for their lanterns, knocking one to the ground, where it shattered, oil sparking briefly in the frost. Ellie ran, not away, but toward Tala. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the creek. "Go," she hissed. He hesitated, eyes locked on hers, then nodded. They plunged into the icy water, moving downstream, the darkness swallowing them as the men shouted behind, scrambling to relight the remaining lantern. The coyote's howl rose, a wild, mournful sound covering their escape. They didn't stop until the ruins were a distant shadow, the creek leading them to a cluster of cottonwoods, their bare branches clawing the sky. Ellie collapsed against a trunk, shivering, the coat sodden but still warm. Tala crouched beside her, his breath steady despite the run. "Safe," he murmured, the word of promise. She nodded, too breathless to speak, the braided cord a lifeline around her wrist. He pulled the blanket from his satchel, draping it over her shoulders atop the coat. The gesture, simple and sure, broke something in her. Tears fell, hot against her frozen cheeks. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "They'll come for you now." Tala's eyes, dark as the night, softened. "They always come. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You're worth it." The admission was raw, a crack in his guarded silence. Ellie's hand found his, her fingers cold but firm, the braided cord brushing his skin. They sat, hands clasped, the creek's murmur their only witness. Dawn broke over the prairie, gray and soft, the frost sparkling like scattered glass. They couldn't stay in Rattlesnake Creek, not with Driscoll's papers and the town's hate. Tala knew a place, a forgotten trader's cabin, miles west, nestled in a valley where the wind sang softer. He'd found it once, hunting. It had walls, a hearth, a start. Ellie nodded when he described it, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. She'd lost her farm, her family, but not her will. The spoon, the awl, the pot, she tucked them into the blanket, her new anchors. They walked west, the prairie opening before them, vast and unforgiving, but theirs to claim. The town's lanterns faded behind, its chains broken, at least for now. They didn't speak much, but their silence was a language now, built on shared gifts and shared risks. Two souls, unseen by the world, had seen each other. The wind carried the coyote's howl, a reminder of the wildness they carried within. Ahead, the cabin waited, a fragile hope in a land that offered none. They walked side by side, not running but choosing, a new path stitched together by cord and courage.